This is Pure Signal, the podcast where we digest the biggest developments in AI, machine learning, big data, and beyond, bringing you strategy-focused insights you need to position your business for an uncertain future. I'm Ryan Medellin, a manager here at Credera in the digital practice, and with me, as always, my trusty partners are North American CEO Kevin Erickson and our Chief Innovative Officer, Jake Carter. Gentlemen, good morning.
Good morning. Well, I'm definitely interested in that beyond. Those first things I'm not certain. I don't know what AI and data and machine learning are. We will fake them with the best of them. But that has been my role here for the last couple of years to do that. But how are you today, Ryan?
I'm good. I had something for you both that I'd love to get your opinions on before we get into the meat of today's episode.
Yeah.
And this could be what some would call a hot take, and I'm sure I'm going to get some grief for this. But just driving in this morning, getting ready to do the pod, it's early, the sun's just coming up, got my coffee in the car. I've left the house where the craziness and the kids are all really excited to start the day. And as a lot more companies starting to return to the office, and I know people have their opinions on that, but for me, something that I really missed that I am enjoying again is that commute. And maybe I'm jaded by this because I don't have a lot of traffic, and there's ways that I can take back roads to get in and out of the office. But it's still about 30, 45 minutes, give or take. But that 30 or 45 minutes in the car, just me and my thoughts and my coffee, I have my radio going. There's something about that buffer between the workday and the home life that I just really missed. And I was one of those people that before the pandemic, when everybody went remote, I had a remote job before that. And it required me to work from home. And of course, all of my friends at the time were amazed that I had a job that I could do this. Like, wait, you don't have to go to an office. And it was nice, but I would find myself in the mornings, even though my office was my home, going out to a gas station to get a coffee or just something before I had kids and we're taking them to daycare and whatnot. Just something to get me out of the house after my morning has begun to kind of shape my brain into getting ready for work. And I would dress up as if I was going into an office. But yeah, this morning, for some reason, on the way in, it just hit me that like this was something that I kind of missed.
Today's episode brought to you by chief people officers and CFOs everywhere who want you to be in the office 5 days a week.
That's going to get clipped into the promo for this.
Quick Trip, who wants you to come back and buy coffee on the way.
I'm not on the take, by the way.
Yeah, all right.
It's interesting. When you started, I was like, wow, that is a hot take. But as you were talking, I get it. Interestingly, for me, it's not the commute in, it's the commute back after work. Like, that's the buffer that I need. I need the time to switch my brain from work mode to kid mode. And the commute back is when I do that.
Yeah, it's one of the things that's been interesting because my commute is half with a kid and half not with a kid. But increasingly, I'm using that time without my kid to record and transcribe meetings, thoughts, elements in that. Then I'm digesting that into our trusty models of choice to be able to actually accelerate that. So that's actually been really relatively new. It's been really kind of interesting so I've increasingly enjoyed that morning time because I've actually been able to accelerate some of just my thinking in a more random way. Then my evening commute, I'm not actually transitioning. Usually that's just whatever meeting I'm late to get to where I'm supposed to go. So that's typically, my question is how long can I sit in my driveway or my car before I get in trouble for not walking in the door to get off a meeting? That's my typical
the trick
evening.
is you don't open the garage. Once you open the garage, it's game over.
Yeah, but I'm getting tracked, so usually it,
Okay. Well, can't help you with that one.
Yeah.
I was always jealous of those, here in Dallas, we don't have the best public transit system. We all have to take our cars to the office unless you want to drive to a train station and then drive even further to where you're actually going once the train lets you off. But the people that are able to, take a train, and I know people have problems with that, but being able to not have to focus on driving, but really being able to, like what you said, Kevin, like if you want to transcribe notes or put down thoughts and really kind of use that time for personal or professional gain, being able to do that uninterrupted. And so tying it back to tech, something that's exciting for me that is like once we get to fully autonomous cars and self-driving cars, I think that will be even exponentially greater of enjoying that commute of just not being able or not having to focus, but just being able to sit back and work on what you want to work on, using that time for really whatever you want outside of having to like focus on the road.
I actually think that we adapt. So one of the things I think that initially 5 years ago that people, at least a lot of employees, I surely enjoyed was that you could you could transition into your day. You actually had more physical day out part of your day where you could meet. And so now that you're adding, and this is, I think you'll increasingly see companies continue to add more and more. As we've talked before on the podcast, I think companies will either be binary. You're going to be in the office or you're not. There's not going to be as much in between. I think we're continuing to see that trend even more from going from 3 to 4 to 5 days. But what needs to change is companies' expectation of how many hours are employees really available. Because once you start to throw in an hour commute on either side, your actual physical number of hours that are within the core day are just less. And I think companies are going to have to go back to readjust to assuming that you're really working on a 60 or 70% capacity for your average employee versus what was 80, 90 when you were just rolling out of home, even if you still had that transitionary period at home. And I don't think, and the run of evidence, at least I see here, and for me personally, but in our world, no one takes lunches anymore.
Right.
Everyone just works through lunch. And I think that that's a symptom of the fact that that's what was happening when everyone was working from home. And now we've not got back into that, taking that classical 60 to 90 minute break. Even if it was a reason we were meeting with, people just don't do it anymore. We just schedule right through it.
Right.
Yeah, lunch was a big thing when I first got into the workforce, of like being invited out with the big dogs in the company and getting to go to lunch with them and get an eye into what that looks like, and that like, wow, I get to just take a break and just fully be here and not have to worry about what's back at the office. And yeah, no, that is something that I can't remember the last time I actually went out and with a group and had that kind of lunch.
We should probably, this is not a podcast takeaway, but we should probably be very intentional about that one.
Yeah, both in terms of what you do with it, how you use it, and other complex. I was on a client this week, and it was interesting. So they bring in lunch every day, and they give it to employees. And so I've been thinking about that because I've just had lunch there with the client, and I think 2 years ago, people were using food to get people to come back to the office. But what was very clear in that environment, even for me thinking about us, was that it was a productivity. So I saw groups of people working. Some obviously just grab food and go, but there was many, and they had tons of great spaces around their campus for people to meet together. So it was actually a way that you're still getting people to have a break, still have time to connect. It's obviously a benefit because the company was in this case paying for the food. And obviously, Jake, in some of the tech companies you came from earlier in your career, that was part of the benefits. People have kind of got away from that, but I actually thought that was a really useful thing. I thought not just for I'm still wanting people to have the mental break, but you can do it in a way that's still really collaborative for your culture and for your movement, and it is an easy way to give people a few extra bucks to get them in the building too.
Yeah.
You mentioned adapt earlier and how companies are adapting, and I think that fits perfectly into what we want to discuss today. And I think there's a lot of things changing right now, AI being the biggest and impacting companies and whatnot. And we were in our pre-show meeting talking a little bit about what we really want to dive into today. And it seems like the way organizations are having to reshape and change is at the forefront right now, a lot like the .com era. And we're kind of seeing that again. And not only the way companies internally are changing, but externally and how they're operating and how they're working in partnerships or in tandem with other companies is also really being put on display of what that relationship looks like. And would love to dive right into that topic today. And from y'all's perspective, what y'all are seeing in the industry and in the market with how that relationship has changed and is changing.
Well, I can start. I was telling Kevin on the way in this morning, I was actually on with one of our clients yesterday. This was their, his role was reported to the CMO of a large pharma organization. But his point on our conversation was, we don't need help right now with the data science. Now, there's a scale there, so I'm sure at some point there is help needed. But his point was, we've got that part figured out. The part that we don't have figured out right now is how do we bring the organization along? Going back to what you were saying, Ryan, I think that's hand in hand with the adaptation of part of the challenge for organizations right now is figuring out the AI, for sure. But I think an equally big part is figuring out how do they make their organization work with the AI.
Yeah.
That's it. That's all you got for me.
Well, I was going to say, well, where was you're the big brain. Like, where's the thoughts? But I mean, I think, just to take that, obviously we're now in kind of, start of fall, which, kicks you into annual planning processes, working through that. I think we've, I have found historically our busiest season of our company is the 90 days between Labor Day and Thanksgiving, or roughly what that is. Yeah. And I think that is the question that has been really consuming me, both in terms of how I serve clients and thinking about where our offerings are going in that sense, but also how do we restructure, annual planning, priorities, initiatives. It's always a chance for you to rethink your company. I'm more convinced that how companies are going to actually structurally change, departments act different, look different, report differently, the expectations for our employees, how you measure success and impact. Right now we're primarily still in a, can you spell AI? That was the last maybe year or two. Now we're in a lot of like velocity improvements. I think that's the season that we're in. People are now thinking about use case, but just whether it be client or internally, like looking at every single thing that we do through a lens of not only AI enhanced velocity improvement, which I think again is where we're at that particular season, but really now increasingly how will it look different and what do we go back? You can't find all the answers in the past, but you can find trends, and so I think for us, we're looking at early PC connectivity, thinking about how we went from punch cards to personal machines, how you had EDI to EDI, that type of stuff. Like, I think that's where the season that we should be looking for. What was the departmental and organizational changes in that moment? Less so, apps and internet and cloud, because those were just different ways that interacted. People weren't changing departments because you were doing cloud computing now versus, but you were absolutely were in the 60s and 70s kind of coming out of that. But I think that, so if we kind of unpack that a little bit, because where you actually go is really around measurement. I think that's a good way to start. Like, how are you going to measure an employee in terms of what's their productivity, both as an individual contributor and as a team? How can you do that? How you work through that? What's the questions that you ask? And some of it is just going to be around that. It's probably understanding again, the methodologies. And then I think the bigger unknown for me is how do you actually see organizational shift? And that's a little bit more murky, but I don't have any answers here, but I tend to go back, unfortunately, to really it's around soft skills, interest, learning. How much are you willing to change your adaptation to change? Which is why I think the innovation and actually change curve is really going to be, I think, the forefront of what companies and clients and really projects are going to be over the next probably season. So 6 to 12 months is going to be around how do you just go from, hey, we want to do it to you have to do it, which is, somewhat even not to go back to the opening, Ryan, but it's a little bit even, where you work. I mean, it's kind of the same thing. Like, it's not questions anymore. Like, hey, you're going to be told or expected to do it. If you don't do it, it's like, well, that's great. Then you can go choose to work somewhere else. Yeah.
Well, coming from my perspective in this middle management area of where I am, it's interesting because, I feel like when things started changing and AI started becoming a thing, and it was almost like you were hiding at first that maybe you were using AI to help velocity because you weren't sure how it would be received from up or below. Right. And then all of a sudden now it seems like it's almost an opportunity to display what you're doing to help make you more efficient. I've seen a lot of things on social media about, whether it's various sales reps or whatever, having their managers come to them and say, there's no way you could have done these types of numbers in a month. What are you doing? And they would tell them what they were doing and how they were using tools to help their velocity. And, it was an opportunity for somebody who has superiors over them to say, wow, that's super interesting. Tell me more about that, because I think that's something that we could all use. It's like the old adage of, work smarter, not harder. It feels like that term is more relevant now than ever. There are ways to be way more efficient without, spending hours on end trying to do something that could take just a very little amount of time.
Well, there's an interesting paradox there, because I think on the one hand, you do have the dynamic that you're describing. Going back to what you were describing with metrics, on the other hand, you have this sense on the part of at least some employees, let's say more frontline employees, where they're saying, look, you want us to use AI. The net effect is all you're doing is saying, I'm doubling what I'm expecting you to deliver. Now, our friend Jason would say, hey, that's good, because that will force the behavior. But there is an interesting disconnect right now.
Yeah. But what's interesting to me on that, and this is, you just mentioned Jason, so I'll play the grumpy old guy here for a second. Like, I think that a lot of it, we've joked a ton. I've joked a ton. I go back to, I'm completely taking it out of context, but I go back to Altman's comments in November of 23, right? The AI is going to have everyone, eating bonbons, and, it's going to really usher in this life of leisure. So I think some of this goes from back, like, what do you expect? Yes, if the goal is to have constant output, And now I can have AI tools, which allows us to do constant output in less. Well, yeah, then you can eat bonbons all day or work in 3-day weeks, or what I think is more realist for society is that, no, you're going to have the people that adopt, the companies that adopt, the organizations that use this that can get more done with less or go deep further. There's no one's going to put a governor, at least in an unregulated environment. No one's going to put a governor that says, hey, great department, you got done what you used to do in 5 days. You got it done by Monday at 3. You can have the rest of the week off. I don't think, just in my CEO hat, that's not going to happen that frequently. But I want to be cautious that we simply just literally raise the expectations by 75% or something like that. But I think if we're honest, that's every single innovation curve. That's what you drive, which is why. So I think that will still be. I actually think measurement won't change. It's just the bar is gonna change. If I take two people, that one is fully infused in using tools that enhance their experience and their human capital, their raw skills, well, they're gonna get more done. And I think even going back, I'm gonna take one diversion for a second. I think what's interesting about going back to some of the in-person versus whatever is also you start to see less side hustles, right? A lot of particularly professional service firms, right? I think that's one of the reasons why people want to have more people together. Some of it's more growth, acceleration, culture, but also a lot of it is I want to make sure what you're doing after 3 o'clock on Monday. And I actually think so. You're going to see productivity gains, and as leaders, as responsible for departmental or company outcomes, we're going to be measured, whether it be by our superiors or by the marketplace for what we're contributing. But I actually think initially it's going to still be just general velocity or output improvements. But then I get into where I think it's much more interesting is going to be around where you have to do it differently. This is where cloud computing actually does make sense, because you got to we kind of rough. I'm sure someone, if Vincent was here, he'd be able to, who wasn't able to join us today. Vincent would actually have some paper or some stat that would say, but the heuristic I've always used is that cloud computing increased velocity by 4x. So you could do, and so you still just took that extra 4x and put that into more backlog. Well, I don't know if that plays out the same way, regardless of what the coefficient is in this space, because I think it's going to require departments thinking together, or projects get done differently. Or, I was again on the client this week just talking about riffing on agile computing versus prototyping, and what is done in a production environment versus what is done in a scripting environment, and you're really playing with it. So, the other thing else, sorry, I'm too much coffee this morning, but one other thing that I was just, the intersection, I read a book over the weekend, really around why big projects fail. And the typical example was large, complex, IT projects or big, huge construction projects. And I was fascinated with the prescription of really hey, plan slow, act fast. And I think what's interesting, whereas what I'd say agile has typically been opposite of that, act fast, and then adjust your outcomes. Right. I'm curious, in the world of AI infused thinking, innovation, whatever else, that actually the planning phase is longer, and you're doing it in environments that allow you to prototype, work through different things, see different outcomes. But when you're actually doing it in the production world, it actually happens extremely fast, because you've done all that almost prep work in a way that allows you not to screw up building a nuclear reactor or something like that, because you're doing whatever.
Well, let's not screw that one up. But my yes and on what you're saying is, yes, I think that's accurate. I also think it changes the way that you do that planning. So it might be longer, but you're doing it completely differently. It is that iterative.
Yep.
You're working with the AI to do it.
So then how do you think about it with either initiatives, prioritization? I mean, how do you you obviously help us and help clients really think about how to prioritize and really kind of bringing ideas together in a way that is really unique to your skill set, I think. But how do you start thinking about that when you bring it, whether it be on a client standpoint or even as companies are thinking about how they organize using more of an innovation, product design type method thinking?
Well, let me actually answer that by sharing what I shared with the executive yesterday. And I do that not because I'm going to say that's absolutely right, because I'm actually curious to know what you think about that. So there's a bit of that dynamic where you could call this is just classical change management. But what we were talking about was you need a number of different elements if you're going to get a company to actually change how they're working with AI. One, we already alluded to, actually you alluded to it, Ryan, when you were talking about it's the field level workers who are changing the way they're working already. So the first one is you've got to get the tools in the hands of your people. That's the distributed innovation idea of, hey, I'm not going to tell you how to use this. I'm just going to enable you to work differently. And hopefully there's some metric there of, what you're setting the expectation of, which actually gets to the second thing. So you need the distributed innovation. You also need, just as importantly, the executive at the top who is setting the bar for, this is what I expect to be different in our organization. This is probably similar to the client you were talking to yesterday. Like somebody who is saying, I am mandating that we are doing this. I'm going to model the behavior and I'm going to champion it in our organization. So you've got to have those two things. But what's really different in this one, in my humble opinion, is you need almost helper functions on each of those. So on the distributed innovation, one of the things that we've been advocating quite a bit recently is bringing in tiger teams, or call it training teams, a small squad who can go sit with the field workers and help them make better use of the distributed tools. So that's one. But then on the other hand, then you need, and again, I don't know if you call this a separate tiger team or if you call this just a SWAT team, but you need a squad that is centralized and buffered to go execute on the use cases that are important to the executives. But there's that interesting little dynamic that happens. If you can get all four of those firing, that's where companies are starting to see some impact. So I'm curious to know what you think about that.
Yeah. Well, a couple different riffs. One, use case and how you think about that across, that's just the new buzzword of the day in terms of, everything is a POC to use case. But what I actually like about it is, is that I actually think it changes what the action is. POC is like, we take this, we're kind of building something out. We're trying to kind of see how that weight prototyping, where use case is more specific. I have a thing I want to do. I know I can do it differently with the tool or this or that, or I'm going to challenge us how to get it done. So it's a very specific problem, which I think is different than oftentimes, at least how we would think about traditional, prototyping, is that we're around, you're kind of almost like ideation. And so I think that's actually more focused, which I actually really appreciate because it helps us narrow. And then the more you break it down into smaller chunks and then it gets into bigger outcomes I think is really intriguing to me.
I think you're right on the use cases. I mean, again, everything new is just something old that we're changing.
Yeah, right.
But with the use cases, I mean, I think even go back to our discussion last week, where a lot of companies have gone wrong is you start with the technology, not with the problem you're solving.
Yeah.
A use case is just a fancy way of getting to what is the actual problem you're solving.
Yeah, no, I agree. And what I think that's building off of that, but then even going back to the thread around how organizations, even one thing we've joked about, we've joked about the stereotype of Kellogg versus stereotype of Booth, and in terms of marketing, data, what I think all of them is what I think is really intriguing to me. We know, whether it be from our project work or from our venture capital backgrounds, like I never care. I mean, we can make a table, say whatever we want. And so I think one that's going to be interesting right now is that whether it be a strategy project or a use case, I don't care about what the data says in that cell at the bottom. It's about how did you get through it and think about that. And I think it's going to be incumbent on, leaders and, in projects really understanding how did you get here, particularly when, we're still in a world where it's almost like I have this magic AI box and, and I have these things that talk to each other and I do these things. I do a little bit of prompting and all of a sudden it comes out in a beautiful language of like, here's what to do. And no one knows how it's got done. So I think we're going to have to really, it's going to be around, I care about how people think. I care about how you structured it. I care about, what did you use? And then particularly as the acceleration continues, and this is where in my own simplistic way, I keep on thinking about early EDI machines where you really are going to just trust models to talk to models. They're going to work through that. How do you know if it has remote accuracy, even though if the outcome looks really good? Again, classical EDI, and everything said the shipment was there, and all of a sudden what I thought was going to be in Dallas ended up in Shanghai. And it's like, and so I think that's the risk of when actuality hits. So I think it's going to be, how do you actually have people explain what they did, how they thought about it, how they prompt it, and then the discussion, again, in the innovation world or in the technology world, similar things that are going to happen is like, how do you then understand playing with those assumptions and have different outcomes? So for me, I get super excited about this because it really starts to put structure behind the data and what you're trying to do. I think then you go back to some of the original premise, like how do you know departments or people are using AI? Well, they're going to be able to explain what they did and how they got there versus, well, see, here's the outcome. Here's my A. So,
well, it goes back to what you had mentioned earlier, the soft skills, right? Using an AI tool, we can all come to the same kind of answers, but what you had just mentioned is super important. It's like going back to third grade math. Oh, cool, you gave me the answer, but how did you get there? Tell me what your thought process was, and what do we do with that, right? So I think the soft skills thing that you had mentioned earlier is a huge piece of where the future is heading, is being able to bone up on those soft skills and have those at hand.
Yeah. And then one thing that I'd love to actually talk about, how companies start incorporating this into roles. But one of the things that gives me pause is that right now we have many people that are using these tools, or we've been around, and we're in the second decade or third decades of most of our careers. We have tons of experience to draw on to help us interpret what's happening. I think about our youngins coming in, or even going all the way to my kids now. They're using these tools in their day-to-day life. Are they actually learning the math behind it, the thinking behind it? Are they going to have the wisdom and discernment to be able to understand why this is a good answer versus a bad answer? Now, again, this question's been asked through the entire history of civilization, so it's not like it's a unique question. But I think it's intriguing right now to where you've got a lot of the things that are going through it. Go back even in history, kind of this, we've talked about before in this podcast, just like going back to the history of technology over the last 200 years. I mean, the simple computers started with 1 + 1. They could go back, do that. You could see how they work. It went from general purpose to specific purpose, or vice versa. Now you're in a world where we don't know where that answer is coming from. We don't know why that happened. We don't know why that probabilistic perspective worked through that. So it's going to be really important for how do people gain experiences to help them understand to get that outcome, versus just being like, I hit the lottery right now because I threw a bunch of stuff in something that came out and my boss liked it, or my client liked it.
Well,
or my doctor thinks that's the right answer.
Right. So, what could go wrong?
Yeah.
Riffing on what you're saying about, your kids, I actually think that is both a curse and a blessing. And what I mean by that is, yes, there is the challenge of let's make sure you still learn how to think. But on the other hand, they will have fundamentally just a completely different relationship with this class of technology than you or I do.
For sure.
Because they grew up native to it.
Yep.
And that will change how they think and probably what they're able to unlock with it.
Yep.
I don't know which side of the equation you come down on.
Well, I think Bluey's better than Barney, so at least they're better off. That generation's better off. So.
No, you're behind. It's all it's K-pop Demon Hunters now.
Well, I'm behind. That's typically true. I'm management consultant, so I'm typically behind. So
I want to get back to something you had said earlier, Kevin, because I'd love the CEO perspective on this, and it was the raising of the bar for organizations, and that bar is going to be continually raised as productivity and efficiency raises with the help of some of these tools. It seems like the marketplace, from my perspective, has already done this, by the sense of over the last 10 years, it's no longer, are you profitable? It's how much are you growing within that profitability, right? So there's throw an erroneous number on it. Are you growing 10%, 11%, whatever those numbers are, right? Those are a bit high. But in the sense of, it seems like the marketplace has already set that bar of, hey, we don't need you to just be profitable. We want you growing at this rate. And it seems like these tools are going to really help that cause of getting to those numbers. Do you see those numbers changing exponentially, or do we think we're going to catch up to those?
Yeah, it's a good question around, like, again, what is the expectations? I actually think the fundamentals will probably be similar. You know what I mean? I think one thing that's going to be interesting is when the true cost of compute and power is going to change the cost structure of a company. I don't think that's not in today yet. And so you start thinking about, I was in another conversation with one of our teammates who is just talking about a new application, from an edge computing perspective, and using satellite technology to help make that more. And it is a really fascinating discussion of like, so I mean, I think that my suspicion is that the metrics will actually be the same. The cost allocation might be different. It might be less human capital. It might be less R&D, but it's going to be raw power. It's going to be other things. It's going to be, we've joked about this before. And again, I feel like we've spent the last 30 years trying to get all the computer and data power, I think, out of our companies and out of the so to speak edge. And now I think we're going to spend a world where a lot of that's going to come back in closer to what you're actually doing things. So that's going to be a physical cost associated with that. But I think the time to market's an interesting one. I think that could be a different measurement. That the pace of change. Think about. Take the classic fast fashion or whatever it's called, the Zara's of the world, right? That stuff like that, where you have innovation occurs, which is more your world, Jake. I think the expectation of change and ability to adapt to it is going to be, I don't know, it'll change the actual growth, but the expectation probably you're going to you're going to get left behind faster than you're going to grow faster. But Jake, what do you think about that?
No, well, you actually be really happy with what I'm about to say as a booth guy, but I think the market's going to set the expectations.
Yeah.
What I mean by that, it kind of just like you're saying with your fast fashion is, I mean, my answer to your question, Ryan, is once enough companies show outsized growth because they're using AI, the market is going to turn around and set that expectation of every other company in their category. Or if the market doesn't do it, some activist investor is going to do it because they're going to go buy up a share and then set the expectation themselves.
Yeah. We're talking about reshaping and what the new organization looks like with all these new tools at our disposal. And you pivoted perfectly to this, and I want to keep on you, Jake, for this because you're definitely experienced in dealing with big ideas. And, you know, if you had a magic lamp and you could rub it, what is something you'd want for your organization? And a lot of times you hear those answers and you're okay, we're going to put that on a roadmap, 5-10 years down the road, but all these things have to happen first. Do we feel like that has now changed where some of these big ideas can be implemented a lot quicker and time to market, what we just discussed? Does that shrink because of, whether it's somebody thinking that, oh, I hear AI, so we can probably do this a lot quicker? Or what's some cautionary tales maybe behind that kind of thinking?
That's a really good question. I will give the answer that is probably pretty common right now, at least among our brethren, which is right now, the challenge is not getting the AI to do what you want the AI to do. The challenge is getting your data in order to feed the AI machine, if that makes any sense. Which, I'll go this back to the wording that you used. That would be the cautionary tale that I would say. Like, what's going to slow companies down right now is not really the AI. It is, hey, our data lives in this disparate, disorganized disarray. And we've got to figure out a way to wire it together and connect it to the machines that we need to make work. Once companies have done that, then yes, I would say you absolutely should be able to get to market faster.
Yeah. So again, talking again about just what the new organization looks like and how that is evolving. We've talked a little bit about like what return to office looks like in a good way, and then what companies are doing. So I would love to hear y'all's perspective on people. We touched on this a little bit with the younger generation coming into these workforces, and I think it's a really unique time. You hear a lot of stories out there right now about entry-level jobs and what those look like with the AI automation. We're seeing that, whether it's recruiters doing interviews in an AI fashion. What would be advice that y'all would give to younger generations or executives that are thinking about bringing on a younger workforce? Because there's opportunity still there. It just looks a little different today.
Yeah, well, and I might add one more thing, and not everyone knows, but I spend a lot of personal time on charter schools and particularly tech-focused charter schools, and so I think about a lot. I think this kind of starts to lead into even what does college look like, and how do we train people? There's a lot of themes that I'm thinking about around that, and I think I'm very bullish on young talent. I think that's our company exists on young talent that's being led and guided by more experienced talent, right? That's most organizations fit that way. I'm going back to Jake's point a second ago. I love the fact that we are, folks that are coming out from an AI more native perspective. I said this, I believe I said this before on a podcast, but one of the things I said to the first day of our intern class this summer was like, I felt like the cohort of those individuals for the most part had more knowledge of how to use AI and incorporate AI in what they do every day than 75 to 95% of my company. And I asked them, like, usually interns come in, your job is to like kind of get in, be seen and all that stuff. And we, our internship program, we actually just treat it like an employee. But like this was a season where I actually felt their ability to influence the culture for change is actually greater than maybe any other intern class that I'd welcomed previously. And I think so. I think we need to have that. But I think how we train, how you work through that, what is going to be classroom versus life experience? What is going to be, and I feel like I'm a broken record where I just keep on going back to the same core soft skills that or just, personality traits, grit, grind, exploration. One of the things I love about, just talked about before about having, dropping off my kids, and one of the particular daughter that I drop off, she's very inquisitive and she's just curious at, she's young around how things work, whether it be businesses or whatever else. Like, I already know that out of my 3 children at this particular stage of their life, that she is a more scientific or business driven mind just because of the questions that she's naturally asking. So then as a parent, I'm like, well, I love that. How do I foster that? Well, how do I encourage the others? But like, so I think it's going to be those, and you're going to see people that gravitate that. There's obviously always an energy associated with emerging talent. So I think the part of the company. So again, go back to the premise. We've heard this a lot. Well, the entry level jobs are going to go away. What I think is this going to be, it's going to look different. I think it's going to be a different shape. I think departments are going to look different. Obviously, our business and most professional services that are based in some sort of a leverage model, I think that the shapes are going to look different. But I think part of the competitive advantage of a company is how do you interject learning and new talent at different levels of it, but you're going to still have to have people to grow. Then I think if I'm telling a young person right now, or someone who's coming into their career, like insatiable desire to learn, exploring different things, challenging your assumptions. It's again from a historical perspective. It's like what made societies grow and adapt. Well, it's often people who looked to do something different. Yep. And I think some of the biggest hindrances or potential roadblocks to really some of this innovation and growth is really around, do we allow natural outcomes to drive results, or do we keep it a bit constrained for whatever reason why you would do that? And I think that's going to be a really interesting question. Now, I think for most companies you can skirt around that, but I think it's going to be intriguing how that plays out.
Jake, final thoughts?
Yeah, my answer is actually similar. Focus more on the executives than on, let's say, the younger generation. But building on what you were saying, in innovation, you have this concept of, if I think about a normal distribution, you want to learn from the edges of the distribution. So a couple deviations away from the mean. And the reasoning is they act differently. And there's usually insights that you can gather if you look at the edges. I say that to say the people who are just entering the workforce are the edges right now. So if I'm an executive, my takeaway is go look at what they're doing. I mean, this is going all the way back to your comment about your sales guy putting up numbers that their boss can't believe. Go figure out what they're doing and go build on that, because they're doing things that you wouldn't expect them to be doing.
And be open to being able to do that. Don't think
and
that
be
it's
open
your
to
way
being
or the
able to
highway.
That's right.
That's a big key takeaway. Well, guys, as always, this has been wonderful. Thanks, everybody, for tuning into this episode of Pure Signal, reminding you to stay curious and stay connected.